I'm going to do part 3 of a sermon that we began just a few weeks ago. I've called it Approaching Our Waters of Marah. This is part 3, and I'm calling this our final leg of the man's journey to Christ's return. One of the things that I've noticed in all the series that we've been doing since 2014, 2015, they all building to a story. It's not just coming up here and giving you a sermon. There's actually a storyline that's going through. So as I was working on this one, I said, well, I don't find any of them that's probably more important than this one. It doesn't have a lot of the flair that some of them did of a doomsday clock series, with a lot of information and news, hard-hitting, fast-moving sermon. But this is just what we need for the time we're in today, because there's none of the sermons that pinpoint specific times and dates, not for the Christ's return, but the time where you are today to that day. Because you see, this one's an anchor. And this is going to be very important that we remember this message or these sermons all coming together, because we're going to need anchors going forward. We're moving into a time when the Bible says there's going to be great false Christs, false prophecies, false, you name it, that's out there. There'll be lies. There'll be people coming to you on TV, and they're doing it already, saying, I had a dream. And God told me, and they bring in tens of thousands of people. Tell us about the dream. I remember a story Ron Dart taught many, many years ago about false prophets, or demons may give you a whisper in your ear. And they may tell you the truth 9 times. And you get so used to hearing that word that you listen to that word, and then they'll lie to you once. And now you're off on the wrong track. So why would you listen to it? Because the person, the voice, the dream I had has always been right. There's one thing I want to try to get through in this series today is this. The message that you're going to see here is going to be your anchor. And you'll see that at the end of this sermon. Doesn't matter that I'm giving it. Anybody else who gives the sermon will still be the same anchor, because it's the Word of God. So I want to get through that today and begin with talking about the point of the bitter waters. So here we have the Lord said, this is actually in Exodus 3. I put it in, but I must have moved the point to move it to the top. It'll probably come in at the end of the slide. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry by the reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them to the land, a good land, a large, and a land flowing with milk and honey. He said, come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And when you have brought them forth, the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. And in a nutshell, an encapsulation of what God's telling Moses is a type where Moses was the type of Jesus Christ. And he's telling him, now go down there and get my people out of bondage, Pharaoh being a type of Satan, away from Satan, and bring them back here on this mountain and worship me. In other words, go give them freedom from the bondage. So we know that story of what God told them, but look at Isaiah 11:11. Always remember, and so far everything I've ever studied that's important toward the end time has a former to it, which brings us to the latter, and this is no different. Isaiah 11:11 says this, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people. So what we're looking at here is a story of God saying, I'm going to come and rescue my people, and I'm going to bring you back so you can worship me upon this mountain. That mountain ultimately is the new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem that's going to come down out of heaven. And that's where we're going to worship God. We're not going to be doing it here or there. It's going to be in the Spirit in that new mountain. Mountain represents kingdoms or the type of leadership and rulership. Worship God upon his holy mountain. Eventually, that's where it's going. This series brings us step by step, showing you how God has laid it out from the beginning of time to get us to that stage. Well, where are we going to? Understanding the bitter waters. The insight into the understanding of the journey of the bitter waters has been a mystery for me for well over 40 years. I've been looking and studying the duality, and the very first time I started studying, it just happened to be with the children of Israel coming out of bondage. And that was the one that was most apparent because of Jesus Christ. It was anybody who studied Christianity and understood the Bible understood that the Lamb was the type of Christ. So you could see from the Old Testament that coming into the New Testament, it was a forerunner of what was going to come, a shadow of events that's going to happen at the end time of Jesus Christ is coming back. But then, of course, you find there's a second coming of Christ. And so when you put all this together, it's a, wow, this is really interesting. It set me on a path that I've studied since the 70s. But it's only been in recent years that it began to make sense why it was coming down. I understood a lot of the history, but it didn't make any sense to me. And bitter waters was one. I couldn't understand the bitter waters. Not that, as I wrote here, not that the bitter waters itself was a mystery, because pretty much everybody understands bitter waters. I mean, how could you misunderstand that? But it was the silence from the Bible of their journey. So when you go back, and I'm going to show you the map, and we'll pull in everything we've been talking about. I'm pulling pieces of that today. We'll tie it all together, and it's going to make absolute sense. I pray I can get that out to you. But it was the journey, because it was so laid out from the time that Moses went to Pharaoh, and he went through the curses and the plagues and the walking of their journeys, and went to here and they went there, and then Pharaoh coming after them, being trapped at the sea, and the sea opening up. But when they got on the other side, it just says they went 3 days journey and they came to Marah. That was it. So why was it so important to understand so much at the beginning, but nothing was here? And as I understand now in recent years, it was because it wasn't time to understand it. But now it is. You see, because this is for this generation. But until you've seen the events, the time, the world, the conditions you're in today, it wouldn't have made any sense of what we were going through. So understanding the journey is where it all begins. And that is the process in the Exodus 11. It was the journey. Now go down and get my people and bring them back. From the rest of the Bible, from that time on, it's telling us our journey. Our journey. But what's laid out here is what I didn't understand, is that God gave us a timeline on that. Now I want to go back here just a second. God reveals his mystery of the end time events through the process of the journey to it, beginning with the crossing of the sea. So when we understand our journey, we pick up the story after the crossing of the sea, because that is the time we live in today. So I've got a map here, and if you go online, you can find maps. They got these places and these cities all over the place, no matter whose map you're looking at and what theologian who's doing it. But basically, is that my phone doing that? Anyway, I did that sometimes. I'll keep a phone, and it keeps ringing, binging and ringing, so I didn't know if that was me or not. Might have did that. But anyway, let me go on. So anyway, the first day journey, they went to Succoth. The second day, they went to Etham. The third day, they went to Midgal. And then they went to the sea crossing on day 4. Now, the reason the church, the worldwide Church of God, basically didn't understand this was this basic, simple misunderstanding of Scripture. Is the worldwide taught, and if you're new and coming in, and we've got thousands of new people who've been tuning in, listening to these messages now, is that they taught that they crossed the sea on the 7th day, not the 4th. And the teaching was built on a proper principle. The proper principle is that God gave mankind 7,000 years or 7 days in type. So our journey from the beginning of Adam to the end and the new heaven, new earth at the end of the millennial reign is 7,000 years. We come out of total bondage. But that doesn't accurately tell the story. Because you see, once you cross the sea, you go 3 days to Marah. On the other side of the sea was not a boundary line that Egypt ended. It was still Egypt. They didn't come out of Egypt until they went past Marah. The bottom line is at the end of 7 days, they actually come out of Egypt, which is the type of bondage. That one principle that was missed has taken away the duality of the understanding of the crossing of the sea, the timing of the sea, the resurrection of Christ in its type and fulfillment in the wave sheath going up, which is a story we put together in the Exodus series that took 9 sermons to put that together. Then we followed through with 3 more to fulfill even more information. So now we got the 7 days, which brings us to Marah. And so from the time they crossed the sea all the way through to the journey of Marah, they go 3 days. They're actually a wilderness region. So by the time they get to Marah, they're pretty thirsty. So they get to Marah, of course, and there's bitter water. Now, I brought this in here because it doesn't play the story that we're talking about today, but it fulfills the story at the end of the sermon that I'm going to share with you today. Elim. Elim is the place that they come to, which has the 70 palm trees, the 12 wells. It's picturing a type, the Jubilee, a new heaven and a new earth coming. That's what that's type, that's where it's coming from. But you have to get through the bitter waters of Marah. And I won't spend a lot of time there because you know the story. When they got there, they couldn't drink the water. It was bitter. So they told them, go grab the tree and throw it in the water, which is the tree of life. And all of a sudden the water's sweet. They were able to drink and they saved their lives. Which is a type, as we move, and I'll just show you today, that's in this series of bitter waters, that you and I are at that reaching that stage right now. We're moving into a time of great bitterness, pain, and suffering. And so what God has done from the beginning of time, he has laid out a timetable, and he's showing us now how to be able to calculate that time to warn us how close you're getting to that time of the bitter waters. Because you see, when the millennium comes in the return of Jesus Christ and he steps foot on the Mount of Olives, it isn't going to be like you've seen with King Charles today, when everybody's out there raising hands and praising and glorifying. They're going to gather against that king and fight him. Totally different than what you've seen today. And by the way, we're going to talk about the King Charles. I didn't want to take it up today in News and Nuggets this coming week, because he's doing a few things that's quite contrary to Scripture. And it's something we need to take aware with on a warning, for example, that he's going to be a king of all faiths. No, you're not. You're not the king of all faiths. You're the king of that nation which represents Jesus Christ in Israel. And I don't think I heard him talk about Christ. I didn't listen to it for a long period of time. I caught the highlights, but I didn't hear Jesus Christ's name mentioned. And they don't want to mention it because they invited the Muslims and all the other churches there. And he's talking about, well, I'm going to be like a king for all of you guys. So anyway, I didn't want to get off on that track. So going into this now, so now we're looking at this. At the end time of the Exodus, Marah was on the edge of the Egyptian border. The waters of Elim were on the outside of Egypt borders, which is the 70 palm trees and the 12 wells. Well, in Numbers 33, and if you haven't read it, you can go back and read it, because God says, write this down exactly as I'm telling you. It's pretty interesting how God told Moses to make sure on this particular thing, make sure you get it exactly where I'm telling you. So they departed from Piharoth, and they passed through the midst of the sea and into the wilderness, and they went 3 days' journey into the wilderness of Etham, and they pitched in Marah. And that was it. That's all we know. That is the story of the 3-day journey. So for all these years, I wondered, why in the world is so little written about that? Well, today we're going to tell you why, what all was written. But to do that now, we need to understand the journey we've been through. We need to understand some of the series and the information that God's been giving us over the last few years. So now what I'm doing here is I'm putting those days on a chart here now so we can put it on a timeline. So when you got it laid out and it's put out in front of you, it's a little easier for the mind to comprehend. So if you're just thinking it through, quite often you miss the pieces of the way they're laid out. So what I put here is what you're looking at. On the 14th day, of course, is the Passover. Everything begins with Christ's sacrifice. Until Christ's sacrifice, there was no life, there was death. Remember, from Adam, all men die. From Christ, we are made alive. But the holy day begins on the 15th. Well, that means the door is being opened up. We knew on the 14th when he was on the stake where the temple shook and the curtain torn into the Holy of Holies, and the access was made to the throne of God. So the actual first day being the holy day was the first time access was given us to the throne of God. But Christ wasn't arisen yet. So that began. That journey, when we look at the Bible, it also tells us in this journey that Jesus Christ, who was crucified from the foundation of the world. So now we see the fulfillment, and the type is the 7,000 years or the 7 days. Everything evolves around Christ. Christ's first coming, Christ's second coming to the new heaven and new earth. That fulfillment and that type is bringing us to the final jubilee of the new heaven and the new earth. It's all tied in together. There's no separation. Without Christ, it doesn't begin. So anyway, we laid it out here. And so what we're looking at is a type of 7 days of unleavened bread that we are putting in God's leaven, because what do we do before days of unleavened bread? You cleared it all out. So for these 7,000 years, we're trying to put God back into perfection in our lives. Of course, of ourselves, we can't do that. So here we have the 7-day journey of Israel. You see that I've put up there, tied into the 7 days of unleavened bread. Here comes Succoth, Etham, Midgall, which is Pi-Haroth, in case you're wondering, the sea crossing, then the 3 days journey to Marah. So everything still lines up exactly perfect. So what we were looking at here was God laid out their journey to tell us the story for us. 1 Corinthians, I'll bring it up later, says that all that was written for you and I so we don't make the same mistakes. What mistakes? Well, they made a bunch. But there's a prophecy in it and said we're going to make a lot more. I'll show you that before we close. All right, so now we take those 7 days. Now I put them on a timeline from creation all the way through to the 7,000 years. This is the beginning of the millennium. Here's the end of the millennium. Here it comes into the millennium at 7,000 years. All right, so we got a timeline up there. We understand the timeline through Isaiah of when Christ's second coming is. So what I've done now is I've taken those 7 days and I've extended them to 7,000 years. You will find in every event that God did and laid it out, if he's given us time, all circles around 4. The circle of 4 means that is the door, it's the opening. It is the access to life. So I didn't put it in here, but if you notice back on all our other charts, every time you see 4, you know what you find here? Blood moons. There were warnings. The time we moved into this season of time, from 2015 now, moving in, you're on a final countdown. That's what God was telling us. It was interesting. I got an email from Neil last night. He said, and I didn't know it. I wasn't paying attention to it this time. He said, there's a blood moon out there. I said, wow. So I told Audrey, and we went out and looked, and we had clouds all over us. We couldn't see it. So wow, I missed that. But it was more than interesting. I wrote him back. King Charles was being coronated tomorrow. And when I looked in and you see all these things are going on, it's that when that blood moon shows, it's never been a good sign for Israel. And it won't be a good sign now either. And I don't know how you feel about that, but to do that, to put this event in, to have that moon lined up from before creation, all these things coming together on that one time in this coronation for a warning of a king who appears to be turning his back even on the Anglican Church of England. It's like, wow. It's phenomenal what God does. He told us the end from the beginning. And I want to tell that story next week. All right, so now let's go on. So here's our journeys now. We're putting them all back in. I keep putting them in. And so it may sound like I'm redundant, but I'm really not. What I'm doing is I'm pulling what you just known, pulling another piece of the puzzle, and I put that, what you just talked about, into this one. So we're building. We're building the puzzle on top of one another. And there's our 3-day journey to Marah after the crossing. In type, the 3 days puts us at the beginning of the tribulation. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that from Hosea. And Hosea says after 2 days, he will revive us or restore us, and the 3rd day we will dwell in his sight. Something to that effect. In other words, by the time the 3rd day comes, what was the 3rd day when the Israelites crossed Egypt? The Red Sea? The bitter waters. So you put the Hosea prophecy into the timing, and it comes out perfect at the beginning. You're at the beginning of the millennium. That's where it's bitter. What do they have to put in? The tree. Jesus Christ, the tree of life, is thrown into the bitterness. and he makes things sweet. So it makes sense? Pretty simple when you know it. I didn't know that 40 years ago. So, wow, when God opens up the scriptures, everything makes sense. Now, I want to keep pointing you to this. I'm pointing you to the scriptures. All this is laid out the scriptures in the timeline that you can see in front of you. You can go back and you can prove them out for yourselves. Now, mankind crosses from death to life through Christ's sacrifice on the fourth day, or the 4,000th year. It says, for then, by the time we get to the second coming, for then shall be great tribulation, bitter waters. Such was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. The tribulation starts the bitter and ends with sweet. You with me? It's pretty simple, huh? Not really complicated when you laid it out in simple terms. It also shows the resurrection on the third day, taking away the bitterness of the penalty of sin. So in type, when Jesus Christ was crucified, he was resurrected on the third day to life. So you see, everything ties in perfectly. Everything is absolutely the way God designed it. Marah in Exodus 23, here's what it says about Marah. So they came to Marah, and they could not drink the waters of Marah, for it was bitter. Therefore they called it Marah. Exodus 15, 22 through 24 is the Exodus version of what we just read earlier. It was going on with 22 through 24. And Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out from the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days' journey into the wilderness, and they found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. God specifically points out the bitterness of this. The journey getting to the time of the return of Jesus Christ is going to be a difficult time. The children of Israel failed their test again. And as we'll see, you know the story. They complained. People like to complain. You know, you go to certain churches and they'll say, oh, it's too hot in this. I need to turn the air conditioner up. Then they'll come back and say, oh, it's too cold in here. It's never too cold for me. I just love it cold. So anyway, we do that. We don't mean to do it sometimes. That's the way we are. So what God's trying to tell us is you're moving into a period of time that you're not going to have what you want. It's not going to be the way it used to be. You're not going to be in a position where then it's going to be that you can sit back, prop your feet up, turn the air conditioner on, have an icebox full of food, sit back and watch TV. It's not going to be working that way in a couple of years. Things are going to become more and more different. Verse 24, and the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? They just wanted to drink water. They were thirsty. But they grumbled at God. It's like, why did you do this to us? Why did you bring us out here? Remember how many times you brought us out here to die? 1 Corinthians said, those things were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age have come. The phrase that comes up from time to time, I hear people talk about, why is God letting this happen to me? You ever heard somebody do that? Yeah, people do that. In other words, it's God's fault that I'm going through this. What's the matter with him? One of the lessons that we lead going in and why God's given us time is to understand you need to set your mind now. If you haven't, be ready to do without. Because in Deuteronomy, God says they had everything they needed and they weren't grateful for it. And I just read here, wait, they went 3 days, they were thirsty. There's a different way to approach it before God, rather than trying to blame him for what we go through. So understanding the bitter waters of Marah, the people murmured against Moses, 1 Corinthians 10, they said, God warns us now, as the example come through, he says, neither murmur you, as some of them also murmured. Now all these things happened to them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world or age have come. Therefore now, he said, let therefore he who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. There is no temptation taken you, but as such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above what you're able, but with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. So what God has laid out here is pretty simple. It's look, you're moving into a tough time. It's the time that the children of Israel failed in the wilderness. They complained, they griped, and God's showing us in the duality of events, you're going to go through that event. You're going to go through a time just like they did. And he gives us here an admonition. He says, you're going to be tempted. You're going to be threatened. He said, but you're going to be able to bear it. You just hang on and you bear it. I was catching a cold, so I took a cold tablet this morning. It's dried my throat out. Not even going to put this off today. I wanted to make sure I got this in so that we can able to bear it. One more thing. Audrey says, you want to go to try to do it, or you want to play a tape? I said, no, we got too many people waiting to hear the sermon. I got to go. So just bear with me if I come across a little rough. All right, going on. So now let's understand in the waters of Marah. It's by the journey. See, we understand the bitter waters. We understand the time we're going into. We've heard it since you've been in the church. We understand what we're about to go through. But to understand the events of the journey that was recorded in advance would only be understood by the end-time generation, which is where we are today. Just like God told Daniel, he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So when he sent out and told that to Daniel, Daniel gives us specifics that he didn't know. Those specifics are being revealed in your and my time today. We're beginning to understand what it was. So thousands of years have gone by from that time till now. So in parts 1 and 2, we covered how God revealed how we are in the end of days through the prophecies of Hosea 6 and Genesis 6. And through them, he points us to the appointed time of the return of Christ through his jubilees and the sevens. So if he's going to tell us in advance, it had to be laid out in advance so that we could understand it. And then he had to lay out the understanding of what he put in here at the right time to be able to understand it. And we also saw through this series we're working on, how God has revealed how we are on the final countdown to the journey of our waters to Marah. So we're on that journey right now. Through those two prophecies that I just put that little box around, Hosea 6 and Genesis, we learned his jubilees and how God counts down time, and we understand how he does it through his sevens. Everything he does is through his sevens, his number of perfection. So we understand the countdown is how we understand. So here's what I brought out in the last sermon. Let me bring it again in case you missed the last sermon. People get confused trying to understand some of the Hebrew into the English, and when God uses a Hebraic term and brings out, well, what does that mean? And it just sounds like all of a sudden you hear these words and you'll tilt. But in simplicity, what God has done, he said, look, I've got 7,000 years, I'm bringing it into jubilees, and I'm bringing it into sevens and then days. Okay, and that's where he goes through, or weeks and then days. So in English, if we were understanding what was going on, supposing you made a 7-year contract with someone. And in that 7-year contract, you agree that you're going to work in servitude, and at the end of 7 years, they're going to give you the land. Well, you're going to put a map, a calendar up there, and you're going to go through and you're going to start, and you're going to go through year by year. You're going to go begin your count. So you put in your count that you're going to go 7 years going through, and some people will do it like a marriage, like Jacob did. He was going to work 7 years for his future bride. Remember? He went through that. So you think at some point in time you're going to check your calendar going through a countdown. So just like the 7 years, well, God had a countdown. He had 7,000 years. He brings us to the last 7. He calls a millennium reign. And that's where you hear many people. Hitler thought he was going to have a millennial reign of evil. So you get your calendar, you begin counting down. So at some point you count down to 1 year. So you got 7 years and you're all the way down. Now I'm down to the last year. So then what? Well, you have to use another name. You can't call it years anymore. It's real simple. You go to the calendar and you begin counting down months. Well, God has millennia, it's 1,000 years, and then he goes into his Jubilee, which is 50 years. And then his Jubilee goes into weeks, and then he goes into a week and then a day. It's the same thing with the countdown. You get into months, eventually you get down to 1 month, you count the weeks. Now you got 4 weeks, or maybe 5, depending on the month. Then you get down to the last week and you get down to days. Well, that's basically what God is doing through his timeline, his countdown. And from the time he began to create, when he created man, he set it all in order, he started his countdown from the beginning. He's been counting down ever since to an appointed time. That's as simple as the complexity of what it is that we're going through. So you had from creation going through in Genesis 1 where you see that God recreated the earth, and you see from Ezekiel and then in Isaiah how Satan was already here and he brought this planet to ruin. It was all black and without any form. It said it became void. And so God put it all back in order. He put man on kind, and he began his countdown for 7,000 years. The central point of it all brought us to the time where 4,000 years at Christ's first coming. The next important event that we understand in the process of mankind's development is 6,000 years. And that is the area that we're coming up to right now. And that was what was given us through the prophecy of Hosea, where he says in Hosea, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, he will heal. He has smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days," so 2 days, as we understand, a day is a year, or a day is 1,000 years, according to Peter, is that he will revive us after 2 days. So when we understand the 2 days, we brings us to 6,000 years, which now comes from that point of the crucifixion to the next return. And so we have the 2,000 years, which is the type of crossing the sea. Remember, crossing the sea, the 4th day. 2 days journey. The 3rd day was the bitter waters. That was the 3rd day journey. So, and it says here, after 2 days, it says he will revive us, and in the 3rd day he will raise us up. And it follows the pattern of the bitter waters of what we see. The 3rd day begins with bitter waters, millennium, Jesus Christ, the fighting. Revelation says the worst time that's ever been. And the end of the 1,000 years ends up sweet through the process. So everything that we're showing is all different pieces of the puzzle, all pointing and saying the exact same thing. Genesis 6:3 shows us how God does the countdown. That's the prophecy. You put these two together. How long and how do we get there? So this is how we get there. Hosea prophecy tells us the events of when they will happen. Genesis 6 shows God's countdown to fulfill his time. Look, it says in Genesis 6. He said, "The Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. When you understood the Hebrew word, the years can also mean cycles or events. And so when you go through the 120 and the cycles we're talking about, the striving with man, God says, I will put up with you for 6,000 years, but that's it. When you go through that 6,000 years, it brings us to 120 cycles or 120 jubilees. And so God uses this chapter here to tell us how he brings us to the countdown to Christ returns, the jubilees. So when you count them down, you see you count all the way down, brings us to where we are, to the last jubilee, which I believe we are in. So now, the fall holy days, which began last year in the fall holy days, began what we believe is the last 7 full years of the final jubilee period entering into the millennium. Now, what you're looking at, if you're new and you haven't seen it, we've been covering this since the Feast of Tabernacles. And we'll put all these together in a series and put them on one page on the website, because it's the millennial reign that leads you into the kingdom of God. That's how you get there. What's important to understand here that we brought in from the doomsday clock is this, is that each one of these 7-year cycles in this jubilee period, the last jubilee before Christ's return, brings in Leviticus 26 as the curses. Each one of the curses has a focal point in each one of those curses. And what I'll be bringing in the future is Deuteronomy follows the same cycles and reinforces Leviticus 26. Leviticus 26 talks about in each one of those 7 times and cycles, the events of bringing us to where you are today. For example, the last one we went through in 2015 to 2022, it talked about he would bring pestilence upon you, and the pestilence would not leave you. Well, that's what we came through in that last 7 years. This cycle is talking about war. And not just war, it's also talking about other events. Let's take a quick look at this. I didn't want to go back through them all, but I just wanted to bring you up to date what you're looking at in case you're new. Will this be the last full 7-year cycle before the fulfillment of Hosea 6, verse 1 and 2 prophecy, which is after 2 days, he will revive us. The third day, he will restore us in his sight. Will it bring it at this point? That would mean if that happens, which I do believe it will, everything we've been going through, it falls exactly at his. We haven't had to change a single thing. The 2030 or 31, depending on what a person believes, I put them both up there because I just don't feel like I want to argue with everybody. We will know. You will know when he comes. But here's the point. That event takes place in the next cycle, the 7th cycle. But see, God says he's going to cut time short. That's not an if. He said he's going to. He said he's going to have to, and no flesh would be saved. Matthew 24. He said, unless I cut time short. What time is he cut short? The time that when God prescribed from the beginning of creation till now. He said, unless I cut that time short. That cycle is not this 7 years. That cycle is the next 7 years. Does that mean that he couldn't do it this 7 years? No, I'm not saying that either. I mean, when he cuts it short, he doesn't tell us how much time he's cutting short. He could come in 2028, 2029. There's enough points in study that brings you to that calendar, and you could prove that point. So I'm not trying to argue that point. I'm trying to argue where we are right now to get us ready for that point. So that's where we are here. So now we're going to move that from the 7 last cycles. Now we're going to move it into the final 7 that we're in now. So what I've done now, we're going from 1,000, then we went to the 50, now we're in 7. Now remember, this is the 7 years of this cycle. According to the Jubilee cycle, you still had one more 7, which I don't think we'll finish that one here. I think that'll be finished by the end of the millennium. So now here's our 7 years, the cycle we're in. Let's put them up so we can keep place. So what do we do here? We went from years to months to weeks to week. That's all we've done. They just get different names when you look at it through God's eyes. So now, there's Genesis 3 and there's Hosea, all come into play. They also do something else here. They connect us to 2 additional prophetic biblical events that tell us what to expect during this 7-year period. During this 7-year period. These 2 points to tell us, that brings us to here. Once God's got us here, now he starts defining what he's doing now, which brings us into more prophetic events. Those 2 take you here, which gives you other prophetic events that we begin looking at here. So that's where we're at now in this period that we're in right now. It brings us to 2 things. Joseph's 7 years of lean and the Israelites crossing the Jordan. These 2 are very important because, again, what we looked at earlier tells us where you are, and through the curses of the time tells you what to expect. That's in the last 50 years. Where you are and what to expect. Now, when we go back each one of those 7 years, what God warned us in Leviticus 26, you've seen that happening every single cycle, just like God warned us. So now you get down to this. What did God do here? Now he's taking the exact same principle, and now through Joseph and the Israelites tell you how long you're going, the 7, and what to expect in the 7. Isn't that amazing? So all we're doing is we're like this map, and you're getting closer and closer. If you were to go into, say, a map of Louisiana, and you go through and you see all these different things in it, and you get in and zoom it in, now you get down to a certain city. Then you zoom in a little further, now you get to a part of the city, and eventually you can get to your house. Well, that's what God's doing in prophecy. And he's done it such a way that we didn't understand that he was doing it, and he started it 6,000 years ago. And then what did he do? He brought in markers, a road sign. And in the road sign, if you're on the road, you go into somewhere that says, Joe's Grocery, turn left at the light. Well, here we got in these road signs, you know, when we get to these 7 years, you know what the road signs are? Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Zephaniah, Haggai. Now you're going to begin to see all the road signs, because you see the road signs are the specifics of the events that's happening in this period. Now they're going to come to life. Now they're going to come and telling you what to expect. Why? Because now you're in that period that God can begin to reveal them. Why can we understand them now? Because you can look at the world and the events through the curses of what's going on. So now let's show you how important this is to tell you where you are today. The Israelites crossing the Jordan. From the example of the Israelites crossing the Jordan, we find that there would be 7 years of war. Well, that's pretty simple, and I'm going to show you how that works out. For the end time generations, they have the 7 years before the Shemitah cycle is completed. Our crossing would have to have taken place on the 10th day of the first month of God's calendar of this year. That's what I brought out in part 1 of this series. That's why this is the anchor. Because we can conclusively understand from the prophecies that we just went through, the 2,000 years today brings us to around 2030. Now you can argue 31, you can argue 29. It doesn't matter at this point if we can understand this. It brings us to the point of where we are. That had to take place. In other words, God called you out of this world. He's moved you across to the Jordan, and you are out there now. That began on April 1st, 2023. There's no turning back. God has brought his calendar down. We're in the final countdown stage. And you know there's people out there in Protestant churches. They see this just like a lot of people see things. And I listened to a guy last Sunday, just want to see what he got to say on this. And you know, he gave a 30-minute program, and it was actually pretty good. And he understood Israel. He understood the 10 toes, and he understood and I'm listening and say, wow, how did he know that? Well, but here, let me tell you how. And this is why this is so important of this anchor. Is that in this information, Satan knows all this too. Just like I said that the person said that they'll talk to you. You'll hear a voice. You'll dream a dream. And they'll tell you the truth 10 times. But then they'll lie to you. Until it got to the end of his message, we could have delivered the exact same sermon. Maybe not as good as he did it. He got to the end, and he talked about dying and going to heaven. He talked about being raptured away. And 2 or 3 other things, so it was a lie. They're just not in the Bible. And everybody's sitting there, yeah. Well, until he took that left turn. And the Bible warns us at the end time, does it not say that people are going to come in and they're going to prophesy? They're going to dream dreams? And people out there, they want to hear dreams. And they bring in thousands of people. And they listen to this. And half of the stuff that they're telling you is lies. Just lies. So what Satan does, he gives you enough truth to lock you into a lie and keep you away from the truth. And here's the bottom line. If they have not the commandments of God, the truth is not in them, and they're liars. So I don't care how many people got half a truth out there and wading through it. God says if they're not keeping, I'm talking about all 10 of them. If they're not keeping all 10 commandments, God says the truth's not in them. Well, they got some truth. They say, oh yeah, they got some truth. But that's what Satan does. He will lock you into, and that's what Brian Dart taught years and years and years ago, that they'll tell you something and all of a sudden now you believe that voice or listen to whatever that wisdom was, and you'll go against the Bible. And we've seen that happen. The 7 years of lean, through the information that God gave us through the lean years, is we find out how the conditions deteriorate as laid out in Leviticus 26. So just as we saw the conditions of the 7 cycles deteriorate, the 7 years will also deteriorate, and God tells us how. Through Joseph. So what God has done, he's defined us step by step, piece by piece, what he wants us to know. Revelation confirms that the conditions as laid out in Joseph's years. So now we can understand, just as we did the 7 years when I showed you those pictures of those cycles, now through Joseph's time, we can also begin to see how that works out. So now those 2 first prophecies now bring us to these events here. Israelites gives us the path in our time. Joseph gives the conditions of the world during the path. During the path. So now we pull these in. I don't want to go through all of them right now, but you can go back and we've studied those through the Doomsday Clock and also through the series of 2023, what to expect. So as we went through this, is that these actual scriptures that God gives us timing of those events, what they're taken to. So here, the first 2 years, Joseph's still not in Egypt. The second 2 years, now all of a sudden, Joseph now is brought into Egypt where God moved him. And eventually they began to deteriorate. So how did they deteriorate? The first year, food was available, but it was getting tight. So we began teaching last year, at the end of actually 2021, that this is what was going to happen in 2022, 2023, and that's what's happened. Food's getting tighter, but it is available. It's getting expensive. By the second year, began to see more food shortages available, but prices increasing even more. So now if you look on the world event, there's food shortages globally now that millions and millions of people now are being threatened. What's going on? By the time of the third year, according to Genesis 47, they began to sell the livestock and to make a living. So what are we talking about moving into? Now, I'll get into that in the next sermon, talking about the economics of the first year. We're moving into this period now because now what we're seeing, we're beginning to feel bank failures coming. We're beginning to see more companies going through bankruptcies. We're seeing people not being able to get loans to be able to continue. So you're beginning to see everything beginning to lock up. So in this third year for Joseph, what did they see? They had to sell their way to make a living. Bank failures, so to speak. But they were an agrarian society, so everything just like we do in the society we live began to take place there. By the fourth year, they began to sell their lands and themselves. Their lands and themselves by the fourth year. When we move into this, if we have another pestilence come through, and we probably will, according to what the Bible tells us, we'll begin to see wars going through. All these things begin to take place. Then we get into the 3.5 years of time of Jacob's trouble. And it just happens to be the last 3 years of the 7-year cycle. So God has meticulously buried through his scripture to reveal to his elect at the end time how these events are going to take place. So this is your anchor. When you hear the news and it says things are good, don't believe them. When you hear a prophet out there somewhere, or some Messiah saying, this is what God told me, and it contradicts what's going on, don't believe them. If I tell you something that contradicts, don't believe me. What did God do here? He gave us his word. Let me show you that at the end as we wrap this up. The conditions in his world, let me back that up as we go through here. In the 7 years, what has to take place? It leaves open for all these things to happen in God's time. I don't know when the seals, each one work. I don't know. I have never gotten to that point yet. There may be something that we don't know today that God will show us. When we do, we will understand. But until then, all we can know is this. You are here. We can confirm that, I believe, from Scripture. Here, I don't know when each one will take place, but we can confirm they are coming. They are coming. So now, after the 7 years, there's one more thing that takes place. The Shemitah cycle actually begins in the fall of 2029. It lasts in the Jubilee, and it concludes in the fall of 2036. This pictures in the ushering of the last 7-year cycle. It also pictures the beginning and the return of Jesus Christ. So here's the question. The Bible shows us that when Christ returns, the world will gather to fight him. Does Joshua, Joseph, and the Jubilee cycle support that? In other words, if everything I've been telling you does it support this? Here's the point. Revelation 19:19. I saw a beast, and the kings of the earth and the armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. In Zechariah 14, behold, the day of the Lord comes, the spoil divided in the midst of you, and I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Well, the Bible supports that's what's coming, but does the story support it? If it doesn't, then everything I've told you has to be discarded and thrown out. How's that? That's the way it is. This is what's coming. And if it doesn't support what we're saying here, then you have to throw it out. Therefore, that's why I went into this period after the 7 years. Joshua had 7 years of battle that took place. When they crossed the Jordan, they had 7 years of war and conflict after they crossed the Jordan, before peace settled in. The piece of land that was promised to Caleb gives us the insight of what we're talking about and confirms the timeline that I've given you today. The piece of land promised to Caleb, look at Joshua 14:7. He said, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. He said, now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years. I was 85 years old. And ever since the Lord spoke to me, this Moses, while the children of was wandered in the wilderness, and lo, now I am this day 85 years old. So now he's given us a time frame. He's laid it out. Deuteronomy brings out another point, though. There were the 40 years in the wilderness, but the story of being told to him didn't happen until the second year. Look at Deuteronomy brings this out. He said, in the space which we came from Kadesh Barnea until we were over the brook Sered was 38 years. So in other words, we took off those 2 years, so 38 more years and then 45. So when you look at his 85, that brings us to 7 years of war. That brings us to 7 years of war. So now we know we have an exact timeline, thankfully because of Caleb. But it tells us more than that. Why is that important? So watch this. Primarily because it confirms that there were 7 years of bitter conflict of war after the Israelites crossed the Jordan and the land had peace. It also shows that there was one more very important point that's overlooked. After the 7 years, there was still the most powerful piece of land with the strongest people that had to be conquered. That was after the 7 years. How do we know that? Well, again, we go back to Scripture. The piece of land that was promised to Caleb, Joshua 14:11 and 12. He says, as yet I am as strong this day as I was in the day that Moses sent me, and my strength was then, and even so my strength is now for war, both to go out and to come in. He said in verse 12, now therefore give me this mountain. What is mountain? Remember we talked about that at the beginning, talk about kingdom, the strength, the power. God said, bring them back to this mountain to God. So you see this final battle begin to take place. He said, whereof the Lord spoke in that day, for you heard in that day how the Anakims, the giants that were there, and that their cities were great and they were fenced. He goes on to say now, this is after the 7 years where he's talking. If so be that the Lord will be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out as the Lord said. Now, we just went through what he said. It was 7 years that they went through. He's 85 years old now, and now he's got one more battle. He waited till last. He says, okay, Moses said I can have that land. Now I want it. Remember the map I had up here, the chart? After the 7 years, there had to be one more battle. And I asked you the question, does the Bible support that? Yeah, if it didn't support it from Joseph, it didn't support it from Joshua, then it couldn't be true? Well, there it is. It is true. At the end of the 7-year cycle, moving into the next, just like the bitter waters, there had to be one last great battle. That's where God brings them all together, and he brings it all to a conclusion and ushers in the sweetness of the millennium. Joshua 14:13 and 14. And Joshua blessed him and gave Caleb the son of Jephunneh of Hebron an inheritance, and Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb, and the land had rest from war. Once that was done, he went out, he conquered it just like he said he would, and God gave the land peace. When Jesus comes back, just like he told to Noah, he said, I'm not going to strive with man all the time. It's going to be 120 years, 120 cycles. It will come to the return of Christ. There'll be one more battle. And that battle, they will gather against Jesus Christ at that day. This scripture, the time, the typology, everything there fits perfectly. Again, rely on the word of God. Don't let anyone tell you anything different. That's why God said in the New Testament, if he said he's out in the wilderness, in the desert, don't believe him. Don't go there. Now, I'm going to go a few more minutes, but I do want to complete this message today. it wouldn't be complete if we didn't understand the final instructions for you and I during the period. He showed us this is our anchor. This is where we are in time. This is how much time we've got. Now, we have never set a day or an hour. We don't know a day or an hour. And it just puzzles me how many people say, we don't set dates. No, but the Bible does. Specifically, on certain things, it sets specific times. God has an appointed time for what he does. He don't give you the day or the hour. He always leaves it open-ended. He doesn't want to give you all of that. But he wants you to know where you're going, because he said he wouldn't do anything unless he told you first. First thing that comes to mind is he told Joshua, be strong and of good courage. Remember, he had spies that gave God an evil report when they first went out. God also shows the separation of the warriors and the family. Now, I closed this out last time, and I wasn't clear enough here, and boy, did I get it from the emails. Let me clarify what I was talking about. I was thinking one thing, and I went a different